Chaos Rising, formerly Ninja Spinner Japan, is releasing on May 22nd, which may or may not have already happened by the time you're watching this. This set has featured support for metal, water, and fire types, so I'll let you guess which cards from those three types will fall completely flat. Darkness also gets a notable new support Pokemon. Oh yeah, and of course, there's a new broken Psychic card in this set as well. That's now mandatory these days, it seems. I'll be starting with the type neutral cards and then go in order, starting with the types that got the best cards first. There will be a rating from 1 to 5 on the screen for each card, 1 being bad, 2 being a bit underpowered, 3 being good but only in the right deck, 4 being good in any deck that can play it, and 5 being so good that it will likely warp the format around its existence. I won't be talking about every GLC legal card in the set, but if I think a card is bad but interesting, I'll be talking about it here. Here are also all the pre-evolutions in the set that are probably worth playing over existing options if you're already using these evolution lines in your deck. So our first type neutral card, we have yet another hand disruption item, joining the ranks of red card and reset stamp. This takes kind of the weakest aspects of both cards, as you are limited to only using it when your opponent is at 3 prizes or less, and you are locked into always setting them to 3 cards, never less than that. It lacks the immediacy of red card while not having the maximum devastating potential of reset stamp to put them down to 1 card in hand in the end of the game. It does at least guarantee they won't redraw any of the cards originally in their hand, since it puts them all to the bottom. But I almost feel like you'd be better off just running Meddling Memo if that's what you want, so that you have the full flexibility to run it out at any point in the game where you know there's something important in your opponent's hand. And of course, Iono and Marnie are just better ways to do that as well. Next up, we have Adversity Insurance. So weakness is always an interesting issue in a monotype format, and this presents a mildly interesting question of whether it's better to get rid of your weakness entirely or to benefit from it by drawing cards. 3 cards in the case of this tool that only triggers if you are hit by damage from an attack your Pokemon is weak to. Generally though, the consensus is that weakness is something that doesn't really come up often enough to bother with wasting a slot in your deck on it. And if you're playing a tank and heal strategy where weakness is one of the only things that's really threatening you, then you might dedicate 1 or maybe 2 cards to removing your weakness, not to draw cards when your 300 HP Pokemon gets knocked out by your weakness. Next up, we have Roxy's Performance. I believe this is the first time we've ever seen a retreat lock effect on a supporter, based on what I could find. Preventing the opponent from retreating seems like kind of an underwhelming effect for a supporter to me, but there is something worth talking about here. Now, unlike abilities that prevent retreating, this cannot be turned off with Ability Lock, though it can be undone by simply healing the poison condition, which happens if the Pokemon evolves and when the opponent uses a trainer card to manually switch, leaving their new Pokemon now able to retreat. Now, the 2 types in GLC that interact the most with the poison condition are Darkness and Grass. Both already have multiple solid retreat lock attackers that fit into their respective archetypes, so I'm assuming this card would fit into a different type of deck. Now, as I'm reading this, I'm realizing that this could actually work with something like Galarian Wheezing to force the opponent to take the higher poison damage, since the easiest way to get out of it is to just switch. Well, if they can't retreat and they can't get their Pokemon out of the active, now instead of taking just 40 and switching, they'll take 40, then 80 back to you, and 120 when it gets back to them, possibly more with something like Perilous Jungle. So maybe this is a supporter that could actually work to force the opponent to take the poison damage in a turbo poison deck. So we're going to move on to the Psychic type, because once again, the purple cards are the headliners of this set. This set features a cycle of single prize Deoxys cards, which all share the same name, which means that you can only play one version of these Deoxys in your Psychic deck. The main one we're going to talk about here is the Deoxys Attack form. Now for 3 Psychic Energy, this does 120 damage. And if you have 2 additional energy, it can be additional energy of any type attached to it, it also does 120 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So we see yet another multi-prize attacker being added to Psychic, with an effect very similar to the banned Amazing Raikou, but requiring 5 energy, so a much higher quantity rather than a diversity of types. 5 energy is definitely a lot, and that's probably what's going to make this card feel more fair than Raikou. But if you can pull off this attack even one time in a game, you're going to gain both a huge prize and board advantage. And I think if you are able to pull this attack off twice successfully, you're definitely winning. And Psychic certainly doesn't lack for ways to power this up. You have the ubiquitous Xatu in Malamar in every Psychic deck, along with Wondrous Patch, Counter Energy, and supporters like Raihan and Crispin. And yes, a Darkness Energy will count towards the 2 extra energy requirements if you already have 3 Psychic attached. And Psychic has even more acceleration hidden in the backlogs of its roster, with cards like Psychic Mirage Gardevoir being easily splashable into any deck that was already playing Gallade. And then you can undo this Gardevoir once you're done using the strange timepiece you're using for Natu. Psychic decks are really well positioned right now to just roll this card right into their decks right away, with maybe 1 or 2 extra sources of energy acceleration needed. Deoxys is pretty much ready to play right out of the pack with very little brewing necessary. Now, if you do want to brew with this card, there's plenty of potential to combo this with Slowking from Stellar Crown. Now, this Slowking's kind of been waiting for a card like this to come out in the Psychic type. Using Deoxys attack with Slowking not only reduces the total energy cost needed from 5 down to 4, it also opens up possible shenanigans with cards like Counter Gain, though we did lose the opportunity to use this with Dimension Valley. Now, with the way the attack is worded, with Counter Gain attached to Slowking, you would only need 3 energy in total to gain the bonus effect of the attack. However, the recent banning has made Slowking a lot less potent, and I really expect Deoxys to just see play in Psychic decks on its own. Insert. And remember, with the way this is worded, you cannot copy this attack with something like Sudowoodo or Mimikyu unless you have 4 energy on those Pokemon. You have to have 2 extra energy attached in addition to the cost you paid for those attacks. Now, Speed Deoxys feels like an updated take on Cleffa. You keep the free retreat and gain the upsides of not having 30 HP and also gaining a fighting resistance. So unlike Cleffa, this card does not get farmed in the fighting matchup by Tinglu and Marshadow. You also deal chip damage with the attack, enough to knock out other babies like Cleffa and Budew. The downsides are that you draw less cards overall, you have to attach an energy to use this, and this card has too much HP to search out with cards like Level Ball and Buddy Buddy Poffin. And also, you can't play the attack form with this. So unfortunately for Deoxys Speed, I think even if you don't care about running the other Deoxys, Tropical Beach is just kind of a better replacement for Cleffa right now. It draws the same number of cards as Cleffa for the same cost, basically skipping your or ending your turn. It's easily searchable by the same cards that search for telepathic energy, and it doesn't give up give up an easy prize, nor does it clog your bench later in the game. This Deoxys feels mostly like a plant for standard, where Cleffa has already rotated, and Budew is still a very common menace in that format. Deoxys defense form can make itself immune to damage from Pokemon with abilities for 3 psychic energy and dealing 80 damage. And that just isn't that useful in the current landscape of GLC. While attackers like Snorlax, Regidrago, Okidogi, and Zamazenta are still common in the format, for every abilitied attacker in a deck, there are generally just as many attackers without abilities. And in fact, I've put up on the screen for each common attacker in each type, there is an equally common attacker now that does not have an ability that can deal with this. In fact, it seems to be the trend that newer powerful attackers seem to be getting printed mostly without abilities these days, and attackers with abilities seem to be becoming the exception rather than the norm, and that leaves the 80 damage of this attack feeling very underwhelming. If this card did 120 damage, it might have seen some niche play, but I think it's very unlikely you will ever go positive in the prize trade with this attack. And the generic Deoxys is pretty generically bad. So we can move on to Xerneas. Now, I mentioned Psychic Mirage Gardevoir during my review of Deoxys attack form, and this Xerneas is basically begging to be played with that Gardevoir. At its base, this attack is doing 90 damage for 3 Psychic Energy, which is bad. Or with a Psychic Mirage in play, that goes up to 120 damage for 2 energy attached, which is okay, but not great, considering we're relying on a stage 2 for that. You then start boosting that damage by 60 for each psychic energy you have on any of your Pokemon. So that's actually kind of nice. You don't have to pile it all on the Xerneas. It does count the energy you have on your bench Pokemon as well. So if you have 2 energy on your bench Pokemon, 2 energy on this, and Psychic Mirage is active, you're potentially hitting for 240 damage. But you have to remember, you're only getting that energy doubling effect for basic energy, so it's not going to double your telepathic energy or your mystery energy or anything like that. So if you're only able to get this to hit for 180, if you've got 3 energy in play, honestly, you're better off just using Latios with that Psychic Mirage ability and with like a Recycle Energy. It's just as effective, and you don't always have to have the Psychic Mirage for it to hit that 180 for a reasonable amount of energy. And I think it's just going to be very hard for anything to compete with the efficiency of Iron Boulder as a basic attacker right now in Psychic, unless it's doing something that breaks prize parity like Deoxys attack form does. And finally, for Psychic, we have a new pre-evolution that I felt was worth talking about. Phantup lets you break the evolution rules by allowing you to evolve it on the turn you play it, except for the first turn of the game, and that is at the cost of placing 2 damage counters on it. Now, while there is already a Phantup that can evolve itself on the first turn of the game through the Ascension attack, there are a couple of interesting Trevenant this could be used with. The most well-known is an Item Lock Trevenant that has an ability that prevents the opponent from playing items while it's in the active spot, though this card has fallen out of favor for the new Frillish form that item locks with an attack as a basic. There's also a Trevenant that increases the energy cost of basic Pokemon attacks by 1, very similar to Seismitoad, but without the attack power to pressure the opponent's attackers. You could basically keep these abilities going without a break with this ability if you have enough Pokemon recovery cards. But as I said, Item Lock is generally better handled by Frillish, and the energy cost increased on the other Trevenant doesn't mean much if you're not going to be one-shotting their attackers back. The damage counters also bring some additional synergy to cards like Monkey Dory without needing to rely so much on Giratina, but you're not benefiting from the full power of the ability with only 2 damage counters, and you have to be able to evolve to use the ability as well. I think if Trevenant gets a really broken card in a future set that can either attack very efficiently or has a very strong ability, this Phantump will make that card shine. Moving on to the Darkness type, Crobat is an exciting card for dark decks, bringing a form of Smooth Over if it's in the active spot. and also having a decent attack for 1 energy. So as long as you have a U-turn board attached, being able to tutor any card to the top of your deck each turn, it's already very strong, especially with a card like Lipard to draw that card immediately. But it really shines in combination with Grimsley's move. Previously, players were having to use cards like Cypher Maniac and stuff like Switching Cups to try to set this play reliably. But now you just need to get your Crobat out, put your Tyranitar or Samurott on top of your deck with the ability, and then play Grimsley to get it out immediately. You could even use this Crobat to go find the Grimsley, and then on the following turn, use Crobat to set up the top of your deck to be able to cheat out whatever Pokemon you want with the Grimsley you just drew. This also comes with a decent 1 energy attack that effectively does 90 damage with the poison it deals, and can also buy a turn with Confusion. 130 HP is pretty bad for a stage 2 in this day and age, but this does at least resist fighting, and it also brings with it a useful stage 1 ability in the Golbat that draws 2 cards when you play it. And useful stage 1 abilities really lift up a stage 2's playability. And I think this is going to be a fantastic card in combination with Lipard and Grimsley's move for increasing the overall consistency and power of Dark decks. Now, I mentioned Golbat, and I'm going to mention this Golbat from the set here since we are already talking about the Crobat. And for 1 energy, this Golbat can block all damage from basic attackers while dealing 30 damage. This might seem really appealing based on some performance by Archaladon, but based on my understanding of the archenemy metal deck that relies on this attack from Archaladon, you have to work towards creating a very specific game state in order for this type of effect to actually matter. Otherwise, it's going to be very easy for the opponent to just find an evolution on their bench that can deal a measly 80 damage to this and bypass this effect. I think Crobat players will be better served just taking their free draw 2 cards ability. And next up we have Qwilfish. Now, Poison was always my favorite way to play Dark type decks in GLC, and this Qwilfish is actually a bigger boost to Poison decks than it might seem at first glance. 1 energy for 80 damage if the defender is already poisoned makes this a comparable attacker to Hoopa. However, when you account for the poison damage, it means you're actually doing 90 damage, and that can get boosted even further by things like Verbank City Gym and Toxicroak. Plus, this very importantly can still hit for weakness, which usually these types of attacks that cost 1 energy on a basic and do 70 plus damage, they usually have a rider on them or are on types that can't hit for weakness. So this is able to hit most of Psychic's best attackers for weakness, which is very important. You can use cards like Hypnotoxic Laser, Garbodor, or Brute Bonnet to pre-poison the defender, or even just rely on this Pokemon's ability, which poisons the attacker whenever it takes damage, and then use a recovery card to get this back, and it's ready to go and attack for 1 energy. But what's really great about this ability is that you can combine it with Pecharunt from Twilight Masquerade. Since promoting Pecharunt after Qwilfish gets knocked out happens before poison is checked. You get to apply Pecharunt's ability immediately, and their attacker takes 6 damage counters for attacking you, plus whatever other poison boosters you may have out, like Perilous Jungle. And this ability triggers even if their attack doesn't KO. So if they're trying to item lock you with Badoo or Frillish, or maybe using a spread attack with something like Electivire, they will still get poisoned. So you use Qwilfish plus something like Brute Bonnet or Garbodor to bully the opponent and take prizes in the early game, and then when they go to KO the Qwilfish, their attacker gets softened up for you to either recover the Qwilfish and KO it and reset the trap, or you could take multiple prizes with something like Guzzlord or Critical Bite Crobat if it's ready. I'm definitely looking forward to trying out Dark Poison again with this in the mix. I've heard good things from the Turbo Blazers working on this deck. Moving on to Water. Water also got a very important new supporting item card although not much to mention in the way of new Pokemon. But Big Catch Net is huge for water decks, if that is the name. I actually don't know what the English name is going to be, but especially for hydro pump decks. This is basically like a super rod and a rescue stretcher stapled onto a single item, or like a super ordinary rod. You get to shuffle 3 water energy and 3 water Pokemon back into your deck for a total of 6 cards recovered by a single item. One of the hardest things about playing Hydro Pump decks is the resource management aspect, since all of its attackers tend to have very high energy costs, and this now makes that a lot easier. Having a single card recovering such a high number of cards also means that water can now likely decrease the overall footprint of recovery cards in the deck without losing the overall volume of cards that it can recover. I predict that many Hydro Pump decks will be likely to narrow their recovery package down to this card, Nessa, and Superior Energy Retrieval, allowing it to replace the other recovery cards with more consistency cards instead. So I think this Keldeo is actually worth considering if you are already running Lapras in your Hydro Pump deck as an early attacker. This hits the same damage numbers as Lapras, 40 damage total for 1 energy, and 70 damage for 2 energy. But being able to split the damage on the 1 energy attack can allow you to set up more KOs later in the game with your Wishy-Washy and Inteleon attacks. And the 70 damage attack allows you to preserve your energy by moving it to your benched Wailord or Kyogre rather than losing it when your attacker gets KO'd. This guy also has 1 retreat compared to Lapras having 3 retreat, which makes it much easier to pivot out of the active spot. Now, 110 HP instead of 130 does make it a bit more vulnerable, specifically to Rayquaza in Dragon and to Natu blindside plays. But those are pretty niche compared to the wider ranging advantages this has over Lapras. But I think generally more water decks are moving away from Lapras, preferring to use their early turns to set up with Basculin or Vulpix, rather than trying to take early KOs. Now, Avalugg is a 160 HP stage 1 that for 1 energy discards the top 6 cards of your deck and does 60 damage for each water energy discarded. There's a rogue water deck in GLC that uses Aqua Storm Kyogre along with some support cards and something like 30 water energy that is something of an inside joke to players that have been playing GLC for a little while and may have encountered this deck. That deck is very basic focused, or basic Pokemon focused, but with Dive Ball and now Pokepad being available, I certainly could see this Avalugg being included in the deck, maybe as an early attacker while Kyogre is still getting powered up. That being said, the whole point of building a deck around Aqua Storm in the first place is that Kyogre takes 2 knockouts each turn and should only have to attack a maximum of 3 times to win the game. Avalugg might hit impressive numbers for just 1 energy, but it's still just taking 1 prize each turn at the cost of being an evolution in a deck archetype that's playing up to 30 energies. Also, none of the discarded cards get shuffled back into the deck, so that's 6 resources gone each time you use this attack just to take a single prize. Golisopod has the same attack as Mega Evolution Marshadow, but on a stage 1 for 1 energy that only does 40 damage. Now, unlike fighting, which has myriad ways to boost its damage, water has to rely more on abilities to do so outside of Muscle Band. However, this could be enabled by spread damage, similar to how Marshadow's greatest enabler is really the Tinglu, and it could possibly be an option in lo-fi water decks, which often include Pokemon like Quick Shooting Inteleon and Greninja that can rack up passive damage on something, setting it up for a KO with this. The set after this one will include the really good Antique Fossil Stadium, which will make it easier to get out this Caracosta, which boosts water Pokemon damage by 30, and Lo-Fi Water already wants to be running the Tortuga from Black Bolt, but this Caracosta only boosts damage against evolution Pokemon when you generally want to be targeting lower HP basic Pokemon with this attack. Also, if you're like me and you got really excited by finding this Ludicolo that can boost one of your attacks by 100 when you involve it, unfortunately, it only works with basic Pokemon attackers for some reason. Boo! Water players, keep this one in the back pocket. You are welcome. And finally, we have the special energy for water. No unique effect here. This is an effect water already had access to in therapeutic energy, just like aromatic energy in grass. Prevents you from having a special condition on your Pokemon. The vast majority of meaningful status conditions being inflicted on your Pokemon will be coming from effects of attacks. And water already has wash energy, which blocks any extra conditions or extra effects of attacks, including other effects like retreat lock, attack lock, etc. So that means the main thing to look for with this card are going to be attackers in water that deal themselves a status condition, which will not be blocked by wash energy, similar to how therapeutic energy combos with Snorlax. And unfortunately, right now, there just isn't anything worthwhile in water to combo with this. We'll have to keep this card in mind if they ever release a new Whale Lord or Slowbro that puts itself to sleep to hit for big damage. Moseying on to Metal, which got some nice support cards, but again, not much in new Pokemon. Metal is being featured this set for a new special energy, and it's not bad. Magnet Metal Energy gives its Pokemon free retreat while attached, an energy version of Floatstone. We've seen this energy effect in Dark and Psychic, and it's very good. It can be a bit awkward when you need to retreat into an attacker that also needs an energy attachment for turn, and also that it doesn't work with Metang's Metal Maker. But just having another way to be able to pivot a future attacker out of the active so you can start using your Jirachi's ability to dig for cards in the early game is probably going to make this special energy that is worth prioritizing in most Metal decks. By the way, Zamazenta is probably the best Pokemon to attach this card to become your pivot, because you also use the energy to attack, but then if you have like a Frying Pan or Full Metal Lab out, Zamazenta can often survive an attack by effectively having 190 HP with its ability, and then you switch it back out, and now it's ready on the bench to be able to retaliate again without having discarded 2 energy to retreat. Really good card to put on your Zamazenta. Felipe is basically Blacksmith for Metal, and yes, Metal can generally make do already with Bronzong and Metang in most cases. However, trainer-based energy acceleration is an important safety valve for when things go wrong, when your opponent has the Hex Maniac, when they have the boss's orders, when one of your evolutions is prized, or when your Metal Maker whiffs. All Metal decks are running Revavroom right now to dump energy into the discard pile, and has other discard outlets in Metal as well, like Galarian Meowth. And there's a Skarmory coming out in the next set after this one that is going to be a good early game attacker that also dumps energy into the discard pile. I think this card is probably at its best in tanky Metal evolution decks with expensive attacks like Copperajah and Aggron, where you might not have the resources to quickly set up both your attackers, which are evolved Pokemon, and your energy engines, which are also evolved Pokemon. Ferrothorn, the one from Team Up, which actually opens up the possibility of multi-prize turns with 4 or 5 energy attached to it. That being said, I could see why some decks would not want to run this when Metal has Bronzong, Metal Saucer, and Raihan already available as well. Having too many of these kinds of cards can contribute to bricking during the early game. It does also have some anti-synergy with the Dialga that shuffles energy back into the deck, so if you're running that, you probably don't want to be running this card. Some Pokemon to talk about in Metal. This Ferrothorn is a bit of an odd one to review. It can do 140 damage for 2 energy if it has a special energy attached. Of course, the thing that really makes this card stand out would be the ability, which is quite a strange one. If the opponent mills this card from your deck, you mill them back. But the fact is that unless you're also trying to win by decking out your opponent, milling them isn't going to meaningfully advance your win condition. And in fact, this is just going to help control decks. They already are trying to empty their deck as fast as possible so they can start setting up infinite loops by stacking a tiny deck. And finally for metal, we have a new Metagross, which can do 150 damage for 4 energy, or 300 if you discard 3 metal energy. Now, Metagross cards always get looked at since Metang has become such a staple in metal decks, so it's low opportunity cost to include a Metagross. This card is getting some attention in Standard due to its weird interaction with Slowking, but in GLC, we don't really have a way to take advantage of this ruling. You just don't really ever want to evolve out of Metang, since it never really stops being useful if you're managing your energy correctly, and only emergency entry Metagross will ever be able to come out alongside Metang rather than removing it. And that brings us to the grass type. I remember thinking this chestnut card looked so cool when it was spoiled. All the way back in, February? Yeah, remember that? Well, chestnut fans rejoice. This is the first GLC legal version printed in over 10 years. That's crazy. You'd think such a popular, beloved Pokemon would get more printings than that. Anyway, this version has 180 HP and does 160 damage and retreat locks for 3 energy, but it's the ability that's the most interesting, doing 30 damage back to any attacker equal to the amount of grass energy attached. And because of how this is worded, it counts energy that's being doubled by Meganium's ability. So if you have 2 grass energy attached and a Meganium out, you'll be dealing 120 damage back whenever you're attacked. And with 3 grass energy cards and Meganium, you'll be hitting back for 180 damage. Surely enough to KO the vast majority of attackers in the format not named Okidogi or Wailord. It seems like this would be awesome, a way to potentially take multiple prizes, first through its attack and then its ability. But this is still a passive ability that your opponent has to walk face first into, eyes wide open. It gives your opponent full agency in how they want to deal with it, and they have a stage 2's worth of time to plan for it. Hex Maniac is the obvious way to deal with this, or they could just Gust KO Meganium, and then Chestnut becomes nerfed before they knock it out. This is a really cool card, but this will be a fun card in casual GLC. Next we have Carnivine. For 3 colorless energy, Carnivine does 80 damage, and it does 160 damage if the defender has no retreat cost. Someday soon, I'm going to make a video talking about how the extremely specific design choices made for the standard format shape the kind of cards we get for GLC in very strange and unintuitive ways, especially for people like me that don't really bother with standard other than the fact that it's my kids' preferred format. This card's design probably has a lot of GLC only players scratching their heads, but the all colorless cost is a giveaway that this was meant to be a universal answer to specific problems in standard format. And standard heads will probably instantly see how this interacts with things like Cynthia's Garchomp EX, and probably more importantly, Latias EX. But I digress. This card is terrible in GLC, and aside from some very specific matchups against things like Jet Cruise Dragonite and Metal Bridge Archaludon, this damage boost is never going to be meaningful. If you really want to try and make this work, slap a Beach Cord into play, or hell, an Altar of the Moon for major style points. Fire really needed some good support. Unfortunately, it will not be getting that support in this set. If you thought this Delphox looked really good, I'm sorry to break it to you, but it's not. It's actually just worse than a Delphox that was printed all the way back in the XY era. This Delphox is a stage 2 that lets you discard a basic fire energy, and then you can draw cards until you have 7 cards in your hand. The old Delphox lets you draw until you have 6 cards in your hand, but you don't have any prerequisites to do so. This Delphox is specifically limited to only being able to discard basic fire energy for the cost. This need for a very specific card type is what really holds this card back, as it will very rarely ever bail you out of getting Ionoed to 1 the way that the old Delphox can. And you may as well just play Salazzle if you're going to rely on discarding basic fire energy, which has the same costs and on average will draw a similar number of cards and is a stage 1. But the reason Salazzle has taken a backseat to Rapidash and Fire lately is that the best 2 energy accelerations in Fire are Charizard and Emboar, and both of those require energy to come from the hand, or at least benefit from attaching from the hand and not from the discard pile. If Fire does ever get a stage 1 equivalent to Dynamotor, I think this card does become a lot better. Somehow, Psychic gets the most broken energy ever printed, and Fire gets Nitro energy. A lot of other content creators have already complained about this card, so now I think there is some debate on whether this is actually worse than Burning Energy, which when that gets discarded, it gets reattached to the attacker. When this gets discarded for the cost of an attack, it goes back to your hand. Now, the fact that this goes back to your hand could actually be a plus if we're assuming that your attacker is going to get knocked out anyway. Now, people may try this in Pig Pony Slug, where it does work with Blaziken's attack, but honestly, it just didn't need to be this bad. Lightning is getting a new Ampharos, and much like Metagross and Matang, people are always waiting for a good Ampharos that can be played alongside Dynamotor, Flaffy, and Lightning. Now, 160 HP on a stage 2 is not great, but 140 damage for 2 energy is efficient and sufficient. But it has an ability that can boost that damage by 80 to 220 if you can hand match your opponent, just like Iron Boulder. Unlike Boulder, however, this ability boosts any of Ampharos' attacks, or any attack that Ampharos uses that hits the active Pokemon. This includes attacks gained from effects like Memory Capsule, Memory Energy, or Shrine of Memories. And interestingly, there is a Flaffy in this set that has a Disconnect attack, which for the same energy cost as Ampharos' attack does 40 damage and item locks the opponent. So if you can continue hand matching your opponent, you can item lock them while dealing 120 damage or more with a Muscle Band or Electro Power, or with the new special Lightning Energy that is coming out in the following set in Pitch Black. Except, of course, this means that you're not able to use Dynamotor Flaffy, so you're limiting yourself to just Electric. And you can't use Rare Candy to try to get this out super quickly. And mid-game item locking may be an annoyance, but it's not going to completely stop your opponent from playing the game, as more than likely they're going to be mostly set up and have access to abilities at that point. So it's not like 120 damage a turn or even 140 damage a turn plus item lock is going to just win the game on its own, or even result in multiple unmatched prizes for you. A luxurious cape on this could be pretty annoying to deal with, much like the Tyranitar in Darkness. So this is a fun little combo they've introduced, and definitely a reason to keep our eyes peeled for Mareep attacks that could become broken with plus 80 damage. That moves us into Dragon, and we see another really interesting ability on a stage 2. 160 HP that does 160 damage for 2 energy, water and a psychic, and discards the top card of your deck. Pretty run-of-the-mill stats for a stage 2 dragon type, but its ability makes it so the opponent might fail to retreat when they try to do so on a coin flip. Now, old head TCG players like me might remember the pain of having to fail to retreat on a coin flip from confusion. But this ability doesn't go as far as making you discard the energy if you fail the coin flip. That being said, a lot of switching in GLC is reliant on retreating, including floatstone and U-turn board, and with so many energy acceleration abilities in the format, only being able to attach to the bench, not being able to retreat your pivot that you powered up on the bench, not being able to retreat to your attacker that you just powered up on the bench could potentially be a huge setback for your opponent. But the fact that it can just randomly fail, even when it does work, the opponent can just use their switching cards to counter this. Pretty much every GLC deck at a minimum plays Escape Rope, Guzma, and Scoop Up Net, with many playing additional switches like Bird Keeper and Mallow and Lana, etc., which all get around this ability. You can also accomplish pretty much the same effect as this with a Tool Jammer without having to deal with the coin flip, assuming the opponent is relying on retreat tools to do their pivoting and doesn't have a natural free retreat Pokemon in play. And Tool Jammer has a ton of other applications like countering HP boosting tools, countering Muscle Band, countering TMs when played on turn 1, and you don't have to deal with playing a stage 2 in your deck. And finally, we've got Colorless. Not much to talk about in this set for Colorless. Tauros doesn't really function in a singleton format, and Cinccino is an EX, so that just leaves us with this little Patrat. It's an interesting question of whether it's worth it for Colorless to include this card as a tech option pretty much just for Munkidori. Now, obviously, this was meant specifically to counter Munkidori, which is seeing a lot of play in Psychic currently, and even more play in Standard. This does also counter some very niche things, like some tank and heal strategies that move and heal damage counters around with Max Potion, using things like Slowbro or Gengar. Although abilities that move energy instead will get around this, as that also combos with Max Potion. It also stops things like Moonglow Reverse Cresselia, which is relevant for spread decks. And it stops Sinister Hand Dusknoir, which used to be popular in Psychic spread decks, but it doesn't seem to really be seeing that much play anymore. And this does not work against Cursed Blast. There's not really enough damage counter manipulation going on to ever really justify this card in GLC, in my opinion. Unless you are trying to play Watchog for some reason, maybe like a Watchog Prison deck where you're like locking down the top of their deck. But don't worry, Colorless fans, there's going to be a lot more for you to talk about in the next set after this one. But that's going to be it for Chaos Rising. Yes, I did end up skipping fighting in this set. The script was getting really long and there just wasn't much there. I mean, Claydol's interesting, but it just doesn't have enough damage. But this is a pretty interesting set overall. I think we'll definitely be seeing an impact on the format from this set, unlike some of the sets in the past. Water is really aiming to be a contender for top tier with this item. Darkness may finally be able to break out of its post twin DCE funk, and Psychic continues to add another multi-prize option to its roster that we all have to now deal with. If there's any cards that I didn't mention that you guys think is going to really shake up the format or is just going to be a lot of fun to play, let me know in the comments. I love hearing your guys' comments. I read all of them, and I really appreciate everyone for doing so. Please don't forget to like and subscribe so that GLC can show up in more people's algorithms, and thank you all for watching. I hope I have improved your GLC experience a little bit with this video.